Welcome to the Holy Post. On today's episode, Ukrainians are courageously resisting the Russian invasion of their country. Some say this is more evidence that patriotism is a godly virtue that we ought to cultivate, but Phil remains somewhat unconvinced. Then a new report by The Baptist seeks to define Christian nationalism, explain why it's so different among white and black Americans, and what we are to do about its spread in the church. Then David Kinnaman is back for another Barna Brief, where he explains some new research about the way churches are trying to measure whether or not they're effective at actually making followers of Jesus, and he talks about what pastors are doing to fight Christian nationalism in their churches. Here is episode 498.
Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is Phil Vischer. It's the Holy Post podcast. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. And Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, Phil. How you doing today?
Good, thanks. And Jason. Hi, Jason. How are you?
Hey there.
Hi. What's your hat, Jason?
Skye and I were just talking about this.
What's the hat?
So I went to a One Republic concert right before the pandemic hit, actually, and one of their albums has this logo on it, and I just thought it was cool, and so I bought it. And
okay.
I think Skye's asked me about it maybe 5 times at this point. Every time he goes, "What's your hat mean?"
Yeah, like which side of Star Wars are you on? If that's your logo, I don't remember.
For those of you not watching, it's a black hat with 3 horizontal red stripes.
Yeah.
So.
And it seems obscure and like it means something, and that's
really
no, it's just cool.
Means something. Okay, and Christian Taylor, where are you?
I'm at home.
No, you're not.
Yes.
That's not possible.
Sweet home Chicago.
Is this your new home office?
This is my new home office. That's why it's so stark, because it's not quite finished, and I certainly haven't decorated, but it's coming along. I can now record in my recording studio. That's a huge,
that's big. That's
wonderful accomplishment.
Well, we will look forward to watching your background change over the coming weeks as you as you paint it Death Star black and do other homey little touches. And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Skye, what was Steve barking at? You had to go silence Steve.
I think a package was being delivered at the front door.
Oh, okay. Okay. Everything's okay now?
Everything's fine.
Steve's fine. Is he going to want to come in and join the podcast?
I don't think so, because Amanda's home and he likes to be with her. Except when she leaves, then he scratches at my door and wants to be with me.
Does Steve prefer Amanda to you?
Oh, yes.
Really?
Most people do.
Well, yeah, people. I didn't know that applied to dogs.
Yeah, it's funny because Amanda's never really been a dog person.
Yeah.
And with Alfie, she kind of tolerated Alfie. Alfie was kind of a jerk in general. Like he just, we were all imposing on his world. But Steve's a lover, and he's very attached to Amanda, and she's very attached to him. And it's kind of funny to watch this. Like, she is really attached to this dog. It's great. I love it. But it's funny to see the two of them together, because I never expected that from her, because she just has never been a huge dog person.
Never expected
What
it.
I loved seeing was the fact that you guys have apparently sent him to training, and now he's actually, following orders a bit.
He's very smart. We can have lots of people over now and not worry about the dog jumping or doing destructive things. So he's been really good.
We tried to train our dog when we got her 5 years ago, and it didn't take.
It's the people that really have to be trained.
No, it's the dog. No, the people were fine. We're not very good at training things. I'm not very good at training things. I just kind of like to take care of myself. If everyone just took care of themselves, dang it, I just turned into a libertarian. How'd that happen? Okay. On French Friday, you and David French talked about Ukraine rather extensively, but you recorded that on Tuesday?
Yeah, like 2 days before the invasion.
Yeah. So, wow, lots has happened since then. Kiev is under attack. NATO is like bonded together like never before, and even Germany was going to send weapons to Ukraine to help defend them. The Swedes might get involved, which they never do. Finland might get involved, which they never do. So it's an interesting question whether Vlad the Impaler, whether Putin overextended himself and made some assumptions that didn't turn out to be true. What are your thoughts since you recorded with Mr. French?
Well, I can't claim to have any expertise whatsoever about geopolitical realities in Ukraine and Russia. All I know is what other people are also seeing on television and in the media. But other than the humanitarian horrors and crisis that are unfolding in the refugees and the people caught in the middle of this completely unnecessary war, which is tragic, I do find myself inspired by the response of the Ukrainians. I mean, the resistance from the president on down to, old women in the streets, like they are just an inspiring example of resistance. And I also wonder if this is actually the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Not just because the Ukrainian resistance will cause him to pay a great cost with the military, but the way the world is uniting now against him and isolating Russia. It's a little too late, but it's not too late, but it would have been better had they done this sooner. But he may actually have just killed his own future. And I hope that's the case. One of the things that strikes me about this whole thing when I kind of put my pastor hat on is it's a reminder of how much of the world is affected by the deep, sometimes dark motivations of a single human soul. Right? Something deep in the soul of Vladimir Putin is broken and evil and pursued this completely unnecessary war. And look at what's unfolded because of one man's brokenness.
Yeah.
And it's kind of frightening when you think about how much of history and how much of the world hinges on these deep subterranean internal spiritual realities of individual people, which is why it's so critically important, not just that we put good people into positions of power, but that we put structures in place to mitigate against bad people. And I think that's something that this moment should remind us of. And, and why we need to really do a lot of work. I'm thinking back to my conversation with Stacey McKenzie about we the fallen people and the way the Constitution was written in the American form of government that was intended to mitigate against the abusive powers of bad people. But we've gone so far from that, and this is a reminder of how terrible things can become when somebody of broken character is given a lot of power.
Right. All right. Christian, what have you been thinking over the last week watching all this?
Well, I'm actually kind of glad to hear you have that perspective, Sky, because I sort of felt like, and again, this is just my own thinking, so don't take it very seriously, but I was looking and watching at the whole thing. And, for me, it seems like we were playing chicken with Putin. And in the beginning, Putin won in the sense that, if you do this, we're going to impose sanctions. If you do this, it's going to be really bad. If you do this. And Putin was like, I'm going to do it anyway. Like he counted the cost, and he figured that the cost was going to be worth it. Clearly the sanctions weren't bothering him. What he wanted was more important, and he spun things the way he spun things. And it reminded me very much of what I felt like we lived through with Donald Trump, where, he would just say something is the reality, and then that was supposed to be everyone's reality. And he just moves forward as if that is the reality. And, in this instance, of course, it led to people dying. And, I don't feel like it is too far to think that any man, not just Vladimir Putin, if they have that, ability to reinvent reality, can go there. So I think I was very dismayed because I felt like, China's probably watching what's going on. And, if it's not going to be so hard for Putin to take the Ukraine, maybe China will just say, we'll just take Taiwan. Nobody's going to do anything. Now, my husband was telling me the sanctions are going to impose, incredible pain, and it will begin to change things. I hope that's true, but I'm worried it's not. What do you think?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. I have two thoughts that I thought in my thinker. One is about globalism, because, so many of us have been kind of demonizing globalism for years, that we're losing all our jobs, and some say losing national sovereignty, because we're now, we're interwoven in this global economy, and the people with power think of themselves less as nationalists and more as globalists. So they don't care about America. They only care about their international conglomerate. But one of the upsides of globalism we're now seeing is that if someone like Putin says, hey, I'm going rogue, everyone else can say, well, guess what? Your country's out of the banking system, and push a button, and they're out of the banking system. And that like, you couldn't have done that in World War II. You couldn't have done that before 20 or 30 years ago, where you could just say your entire economy is disconnected from global banking, which you're dependent on, with the push of a button, and your economy is going to crash. We can crash your economy remotely. So that's a kind of a wonderful weapon, because no one's going to die. You don't put any, you don't send soldiers out. You don't start bombing civilians in Russia. You just say your banks can't borrow money anymore. So globalism has a downside, in that jobs get transferred to the part of the world with the lowest labor costs. But it has an upside, in that when someone goes rogue and think they can do it with impunity, it's pretty easy to pune. Is that the opposite of impunity? So that was my first thought. Okay. Anybody disagree? Agree?
No.
Disagree? Okay. You're still with me? Okay. My second thought is about patriotism, because you remember when we had that little uproar about patriotism and nationalism a couple months ago, where I said on Twitter that they weren't biblical imperatives, because they can go horribly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And people were saying, and then people got all bent out of shape and said, oh, you think patriotism is sinful? You're a jerk. It's not exactly what they said, but something like that. And I said, no, I'm just saying it's not a biblical imperative, because it's, loving neighbor has the guardrails of not hurting your neighbors, and loving your country does not have the guardrails of not hurting your neighbors if they're not in your country. Anyway, so Zelensky. Yeah, Zelensky is now a hero, because he's standing up for Ukraine, and he went viral for his video on the street of, I'm not leaving, I don't want the ride, I want ammunition. And it was very inspiring. Like, yeah, he's a new hero. And so several people have said, see, Phil Vischer, you were wrong about patriotism. You were wrong. And they've actually, a couple of people even retweeted my original tweet of saying how nationalism and patriotism can lead to bad things and aren't a biblical imperative, to say that this is how Phil Vischer was wrong. And I just got to say, I don't think I was wrong, because patriotism and nationalism are also driving Vladimir Putin on the other side. So yes, it's good that the patriotic Ukrainians are rising up to defend their sovereignty, and defending your sovereignty certainly isn't a bad thing. But at the same time, it's the nationalism, it's Putin's sense of grievance from the fall of the Soviet Union, and NATO aligning against him. It's the same thing it was with Hitler. It was grieved nationalism that it led to this action in the first place. So it rather than being a proof text for patriotism is good, it's actually just shows that it can go either way. It can cause wars and end wars.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
there's an important point there, that one of the things that doesn't get reported enough in the United States is how much Russian propaganda fed into this thing. And of course, the media in Russia is completely a propaganda arm of Putin's regime. And what they've been pumping into the Russian population through their media is a message, two basic things. Number one, what you heard Putin say the other week in his speech, arguing that Ukraine is really part of Russia. These are our brothers and sisters. These are Russians. And number two, that the government in Ukraine is basically run by Nazis. And so we need to go in there and rescue our brethren from the oppression of Nazis. And Nazism, especially for Russians, has a very visceral response, because I think it was about 17 million Russians died in World War II. More Russians than any other country fought against the Nazis. And so Nazism is seen as as evil as we consider it. It's this horrific evil to the Russians. And so the public in Russia has been sold this bill of goods that we are going in under patriotic, altruistic, we're going to rescue our brethren from this evil regime in Ukraine. And, it's just a reminder of how powerful media can be. And when media becomes just an arm of propaganda, it's horrific. And that's part of I've been stunned to see some of the stuff coming out of some right-wing American media that is pro-Putin. And it's just shocking. So the propaganda piece of this is important, but I think that's where your point, Phil, that patriotism and nationalism can be dangerous. Well, any love can be dangerous when it becomes twisted and perverted and used in a propaganda kind of way. So, I think it's really weird to make a blanket statement like nationalism and patriotism are inherently good when anything that's good can be twisted into evil. So,
right. Christian.
Yeah, I mean, that was basically what I was going to say. You didn't make a statement saying that it was always this way. I think people took you to say that. And, whatever has the greatest potential for good also seems to have the greatest potential for evil. And I think that's definitely true here.
Yeah. Okay. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. Don't you think? Because we just, Europe has been peaceful for so long that like when Germany says, we actually are going to spend more on defense now. We actually are. Somebody said Putin just accomplished what Trump tried to accomplish for 4 years, which was get Germany to spend more on its own defense. And it happened.
One of the things that's frustrating about this, and Christian kind of alluded to it, is anybody who's been watching Putin for a while should not have been surprised.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And was it Maya Angelou who famously said that when somebody shows you who they are, believe them?
Right.
And he's been showing the world for 20 years who he is. And I think we were multiple administrations, not from one party to the other, but multiple administrations were kind of wishful in their thinking and hopeful that Vladimir Putin wouldn't turn out to be the tyrant that he is. And that wishful thinking is a bad way to make foreign policy. And if anybody should feel vindicated right now, it's Mitt Romney, who back in 2012 argued that Russia was our greatest geopolitical foe, and Barack Obama kind of laughed it off, going, he said something like the 80s called and wants their foreign policy back. But he was right. And John McCain, too. He also argued that we should have been arming the Ukrainians years ago, back in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, and we didn't really do it. So, it's just how many times do we have to go through this before we learn the lesson that when tyrants like this get their nose under the tent, like, you got to cut it off. Like, you just can't let this keep going.
Yeah.
So
Christian.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, more like a statement, I suppose. I just spent about 3 weeks traveling with 2 of my French cast members while all of this happened. The last time they were here, the pandemic started. This time, Ukraine and Russia started. We're not going to let them come back anymore. But what was interesting as I was traveling with them was to hear the French perspective of what's been going on. And their perspective, and again, it's just their perspective in France, but I think we tend to have the idea that the rest of the world thinks, the rest of the allies think sort of like we do about all of the global issues. And what I learned from them is that is not necessarily true. In a lot of ways, Europeans feel like they all have to follow what the US says and what the US does if they want US protection. And they are starting to get, a little frustrated with that. And they don't love it so much. And they feel like we possibly spin news and events, to suit our purposes. And the other thing that they were telling me was that they could understand Russia's point of view, Vladimir Putin's point of view. This used to be our Soviet Union. We really should have it back. And they were basically saying he has a point of view. We may not agree with it, but, we should. And I thought that was so interesting because most people in the US, I think, that I've talked to wouldn't approach it that way. And But maybe that explains where some pro-Putin people are coming from. I do not know, but it is confusing.
Yeah, but no pro-Putin people in the U.S. Aren't thinking, hey, they should put the Soviet Union back together. They're thinking, hey, this guy stands up against the liberal left. He stands up. He's saying he's standing up for, the Orthodox Church and Christian values. We want a fighter. So he's a Trump, I'll fight for your values kind of a figure. And Eric Metaxas on the radio last week said, why do we think Putin's such a bad guy? The real bad guy is Trudeau in Canada. So he's jumped on that bandwagon.
Yeah, because Trudeau is poisoning his political enemies around the world and assassinating people and invading countries and causing thousands of deaths.
Poisoning his enemies with vaccines.
Right. Christian, to your point, or to the French argument, the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, and the different republics that made up the Soviet Union sought their independence and were granted their independence. They didn't fight a rebellion. They didn't break away in a civil war. It was a mutually agreed upon arrangement where Ukraine and these other countries became independent nations. Vladimir Putin may well think that was a travesty and that never should have happened. Fine. If he really thinks Ukraine should be part of the Russian Empire again, then go to the people of Ukraine and say, hey, do you want to come back in? Do you want to join us again? Because if the Ukrainian people were to vote or decide that, yes, we want to be part of Russia again, fine, go for it.
Then you wouldn't have to kill them.
The problem is, I don't remember what the poll, but an overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian people were polled, and they do not want to be part of Russia. And so that's where I think that if you're articulating the French argument correctly, I think it's kind of insane. It's a little bit ridiculous because it wasn't that Ukraine was stolen from Russia. They gave it up and they volunteered to give it up. And if Ukraine wants to go back, they can do that. They don't want that. And so Vladimir Putin is forcing them with tanks and artillery and weapons at a point of a gun barrel to come back. That is not justice. That's not freedom. That's tyranny. And that's what's ridiculous. So there is no moral justification for what Putin is doing, and nobody
that's why they don't want to be there.
Yeah. So I've been kind of gnawed. I mean, I can be very critical of the United States and some different things we've done, but I've been seeing people on my Twitter page basically saying, there's moral equivalence between what Russia's doing in Ukraine and what America has done in other countries when we've invaded. I'm sorry. I did not agree with the Iraq invasion in 2003, but it is not the same as what Ukraine is happening to Ukraine right now or what Russia is doing. They are not morally equivalent, and certainly not what we did in Afghanistan or anywhere else in recent history. So this idea of we need to make some moral justification for Putin or America is just as bad. No, I'm not willing to go there. That is just a bad faith argument. And it's a false equivalency. It's like saying that dish soap and diarrhea are the same because they're both liquids. No, just because the military is involved in invading a country does not mean they're morally equivalent.
That was icky, Sky.
Good analogy, though. It'll stick with me.
Mm-hmm. That was icky. All right, let's move on. And Jason says, hey, let's remind everybody that we're recording this on Monday, the 28th, in case everything is different by the time you listen to this on Wednesday, the 2nd. Is that Wednesday the 2nd? This is the last day of February. Let's talk. We've been talking on and off about Christian nationalism, maybe too much. Maybe we're sick of talking about Christian nationalism, except people keep writing interesting things about it. And there's some new stuff that's come out recently, including a report from the Baptist Joint Committee. Do you know what the Baptist Joint Committee is?
Does that involve marijuana?
It's no, it's some sort of Baptist group of lawyers. It's the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty, which is not the ERLC. It's outside of, this is not in the Southern Baptist Conference. Anyway, they put out a report on Christian nationalism and the January 6th, 2021 insurrection. Try to get to the bottom of the role of religion in the assault on the Capitol. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about race, and I want to talk about how race and Christian nationalism kind of intersect, because some people say, when they say Christian nationalism, they put white in front of it and say white Christian nationalism, and a lot of people are sick of hearing the word white put in front of other things where it didn't used to be in front of other things, like evangelicalism or the church in America, or whatever. Castle, yes. So I want to talk about Christian nationalism and race. And first of all, there is a perception gap, a Christian nationalism and the racial perception gap. This is a story that came out a couple of weeks ago. For many Christian Americans, discussions of structural racism amount to attacks on America and its Christian heritage itself. So for many people, I think we've seen this, if you criticize America for racism that is structural, not just some bad apples doing some bad things, you're perceived as attacking America itself, and then in some ways attacking Christian history. The authors of this study find that white proponents of Christian nationalism tend to minimize anti-Black discrimination and deny the presence of systemic racism in policing. So if you were a supporter of Christian nationalism, and they have a test for determining that, you were more likely to believe, for example, that the men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery were, quote, not necessarily racist, and that they acted within their rights as vigilantes. Okay. So there's a connection.
Do vigilantes have rights?
Within their rights as well, in Florida. Was that in Florida? No, it wasn't. It was in
South Carolina?
South Carolina?
Georgia.
Okay.
Georgia, I think.
Because Florida has the Stand Your Ground law that helped George Zimmerman walk, after he killed Trayvon Martin. And that is, you can be a vigilante in Florida if someone threatens you. If you feel threatened, you can now kill them. Unlike whites who accept Christian nationalism, and this is where the racial aspect of it, unlike whites who accept Christian nationalism, Black respondents recognize who affirm, Black respondents who affirmed the ideology did so while recognizing racial discrimination against Black Americans. So in other words, there's a huge difference in how white Christians who identify with some of the markers of Christian nationalism. We believe that America was founded on Christian values. For example, we believe that the federal government should promote Christian values. Many Black Americans believe that, but they interpret it in a very different way. They interpret it like Frederick Douglass, saying, let's hold ourselves accountable to what we actually promised in the beginning of treating everyone equally under God, of the Declaration of Independence. So African Americans who believe America is Christian are more likely to say, but we've failed badly in living up to the values that we promote. White Americans who say they believe America is Christian are more likely to think we have lived up to our values. And so if you tell me otherwise, I'm offended with you.
That makes total sense.
Yes, total sense.
Because the lived experience of those two groups is generally very different. For
quite
one
different.
Group, the system has worked pretty well. And for the other group, in general, the system over 200 years has not worked very well.
Right. So now we get to the report from the Baptist Joint Committee. I wonder if they have a secret lab somewhere, the Baptist Joint Committee, like the Justice League. That would be fun. And they actually gave Amanda Tyler of the BJC, the Baptist Joint Committee, gave the best definition of Christian nationalism I think I've ever heard, because it's really hard to define. So here's her definition of Christian nationalism. She describes it as a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy.
That is good.
Let me say that again. A political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Like that, Sky? Pretty good? Huh?
I do.
Pretty good, huh?
What it doesn't address, though, is what is it distorting them into?
Other things.
Well, yeah, obviously.
A new
that's what
ideology.
Yeah, normally I hear the Christian nationalism as a combining of Christian faith and American cultural identity, but she's emphasizing the fact that combination distorts both.
Yes.
I just have one question about that. How does it distort the nationalism part?
Because, we're seeing now with people that score very high on Christian nationalism, they're more likely to support violence to get the election outcome that we want.
Right. They're not pro-democracy. They're not pro-free speech. They're not ironically, they're not pro-constitution or secularism.
So
how does the Christian part distort that?
It's the combination. It's the combination of two, because America is supposed to be Christian. And so if people are voting for it not to be Christian, we have to take away their votes. See?
Okay. That helps me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or you can't give people freedom of religion if they're going to practice a religion other than Christianity.
Right. Like Flynn, General Flynn, who said, if we're going to be one nation under God, then we need to have one religion. We can't have more than one religion in America. So that's fun. And he's touring the country right now to churches saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, even as we speak. Okay. So there's some interesting studies, interesting data in this research. They tracked people who and asked them the question, or these statements, do you agree with these statements? I consider the founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, to be divinely inspired. Okay? Divinely, the famous picture of Jesus handing the Constitution to Thomas Jefferson.
But that's the irony, is even if they do believe that, they don't actually affirm the Constitution.
Well, if
a lot of people don't know what the Constitution says.
Yeah, other than select parts like the Second Amendment or whatever.
I wasn't done yet.
Sorry.
Thank you. Jason, would you like to apologize to me too?
Sure. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. I still don't understand your hat. Okay, here we go. So I consider the founding documents to be divinely inspired. Second question, the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation. So officially, just put your foot down. This is a Christian nation. And
which would be a violation of the Constitution,
which is divinely inspired.
Right.
Hey, don't give me internal contradictions in my logic. So, and then they tracked those beliefs, people who score very high in agreement with those two statements, against, do they agree with these other statements? So one of the other statements they then asked as, outside agitators like Antifa and Black Lives Matter were mixed into the crowd on January 6th and initiated the violence. So it wasn't the good guys who started the violence on January 6th. It was Antifa and Black Lives Matter. And guess what? There's an exact correlation between how much you agree with that statement and how much you agree with those Christian nationalist statements. In fact, if you strongly agree with both those Christian national statements, you are almost 90% likely to agree that BLM and Antifa started the violence on January 6th. Okay, next one. Who agrees with the statement, President Trump holds much of the blame for the event escalating into violence? And there's an inverse correlation. This will shock you. The more you believe the Constitution is divinely inspired and the federal government should say the U.S. is a Christian nation, the less you blame Donald Trump for having any role in the violence on January 6th. Okay. And guess what? The same thing is true of this statement. The violence at the Capitol was the result of misinformation spread by Trump and others about the election. Guess what? If you believe the Constitution was divinely inspired and the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation, you strongly, like only 10%, agree with the statement that the violence at the Capitol was caused by misinformation spread by Trump and others.
They should be called the Joint Baptist Committee for the Obvious. Right? I mean, is anyone surprised by any of these findings?
Well, okay, but there's not, if you believe America is Christian, that doesn't necessarily mean you would believe Antifa was at the Capitol on January 6th. Well, so what's the connection?
No, but I think the connection is the source of your information.
Mm-hmm.
People who I think are deeply embedded in Christian nationalism are going to be getting their information from media sources that are aligned with a very pro-Trump, pro-right-wing pro-conspiracy theory explanation for stuff. And we know what the narratives have been out of those media outlets. So it's bundled together.
Yeah. They run through a whole list of things. If you embrace white Christian nationalism as defined here, you are more likely to ignore the safe behaviors and participate in dangerous behaviors related to the pandemic. You're more likely to want to protect the economy and liberty over the vulnerable during the pandemic. You're more likely to oppose any federal gun control restrictions. So if you think the Constitution is divinely inspired, don't take my gun. Not sure what the connection there is either. You hold more likely to hold anti-vaccine attitudes, more likely to distrust science and scientists, more likely to support Trump and Trumpism, more likely to fear immigrants and endorse anti-immigrant policies, more likely to endorse traditional gender roles, more likely to hold anti-democratic attitudes favoring restricting the vote and denying the existence of voter suppression.
So
it kind of all lines up.
Yeah, what does this all lead to? What's their big conclusion at the end? What are we supposed to do with this fact that all these things are bundled together?
I think
Good question, Sky. You sound like me.
I do. I sound like Christian. I jumped the gun.
Okay. This is another interesting thing they discovered, and this might be helpful. One fascinating finding in almost all of these studies, though, is that religious practice and Christian nationalism are not one and the same. Pointing out the negative influence of Christian nationalism is not to be equated with decrying religious practice or Christianity itself writ large. In fact, one researcher's account for the influence of Christian nationalism. Once researchers account for the influence of Christian nationalism and hold it constant, the influence of religious practice works in the exact opposite direction of Christian nationalism.
So what does that mean?
People that are more devoutly religious and actually practice their religion every day are the opposite of on all these cases.
Right.
So they're less likely. So they're more likely to be welcoming to immigrants, more likely to want to wear masks to protect their neighbors. So basically, what is done by Fox News and right-wing media is undone by devotion to the Bible.
So another way of putting it is Christian nationalism is a false gospel. It's a false form of Christianity that is not aligned with the teachings of Jesus.
Just like CRT and deconstruction.
But that's what's ironic is when people who are strongly in the camp of Christian nationalism, one of the things that they hold up as a banner is that we are truly Christian, when what they are actually declaring is that we are profoundly unchristian. And that's what gets so confusing to people.
Yeah.
And we've said this many, many times on the show, but statistically speaking, the group of Americans who are most orthodox in their faith and most committed to the teachings of Scripture are African Americans. And so what do you do then with the fact that there is this growing segment of white Americans who are claiming Christian identity, yet based on the data are behaving in a way that's completely contrary to the Christian faith? That's really frustrating.
Right. The conclusion, therefore, it is important to confront and oppose white Christian nationalism because it is intent on privileging access to political and cultural power for only a certain subset of Americans. But expressions of Christianity that encourage Americans to participate in a pluralistic democratic society are something else entirely. So it is a kind of a call to, hey, you can resist Christian nationalism without being against Christianity in any way, shape, or form.
But can I just say one thing?
Yes, Christian Taylor.
So let's just get practical here.
Okay.
The people that ascribe to a Christian nationalist worldview, for the most part, absolutely deny that they adhere to a Christian nationalist point of view.
Well, but if you ask them those questions and they agree with them, is the Constitution divinely inspired? And they say, well, totally.
Yep, but that is kind of irrelevant because the issue is if people don't realize that they are in that camp of viewing, Christianity and politics that way, then there really is no, need to try to change that or amend that. That's number one. And two, if you're not in the Christian nationalists or if you're not practicing Christian nationalism and we're told to resist it, what exactly does that mean?
I'll tell you what it means.
believe that are
Guy's
not
going to
going
tell you
to
what it means.
agree with you.
I'll tell you what it means. It means that if you are a leader in a predominantly white Christian or evangelical community, pastor, church leader, something like that, you never have to use the words Christian nationalism, but you need to be aware that this heresy is infecting more and more of your people through media and through different sources. And what you do need to do if you care about your sheep and your flock and protecting them from false doctrine and being led astray is you need to openly and regularly talk about these false teachings and call them out. For example, if you're a pastor, once in a while you need to say, hey, I'm grateful to live in the United States and to be a citizen and have the protections of our Constitution. But we need to be clear, the Constitution is a man-made document. It is not inspired scripture the way we believe the Bible is. Or, you know, I'm grateful to be an American, to live in this country, and there's a lot of blessings here. But part of being a Christian is to look at the log in our own eye rather than just pointing out the speck in our brothers. And sometimes we need to be honest about the ways that we have not followed the teachings of Jesus in this country and do what's right. Like when you talk about that stuff openly in your congregation, you are detoxifying or taking the power out of the Christian nationalism that some people are marinating in. But if you never talk about that stuff, if you never mention the fact that racism is real or that America has some problems in its past, or sometimes the Constitution needs to be amended because it's not perfect, if you never talk about any of that, then you're giving no resistance to the messages of Christian nationalism that are leading people astray. And that's the problem, is too many of our Christian communities are silent, and therefore there's no one counteracting the power of these messages that people are encountering in the media.
Did that work for you?
Yeah, I can't argue with that, but I do wonder as not a pastor, how I apply this, because as we've talked in the past when we were talking about Trump, issues or policies, if you were talking to people that are in that Christian nationalism camp, and if you are saying the stuff that you just said, Sky, all it does is invite conflict and, division, and there really is no receptive or open conversation about that.
Yeah, and sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you're going to lose people from your church or community because they don't want to follow Jesus. And that's okay.
You know what you sound like? I remember when I started doing this movie project thing, and it was really overtaking my whole life, and I was having to decide, do I keep going down this road knowing that I feel called to do this and I'm over 3/4 of the way in, or do I just stop? And Jeremy said to me at one point, when you are carrying something this big, you have to make decisions, and your decisions are going to disappoint people, and you're going to have to be okay with that. And I sat and wrestled with that and realized that I had been idolizing people's opinions or their thoughts or their happiness, because I tend to be a people-pleasing person. And I do think that what I'm hearing you say, Sky, resonates with this series that you've been doing on idolatry, is if we have that fear of, being rejected or not being liked or getting into an argument, we might be idolizing the wrong thing.
Yeah, and it's not easy. I don't want to be flippant about it, but we all know the story of the rich young ruler, and Jesus said, go sell everything you have and come follow me. And he couldn't do it because he had great wealth, and Jesus grieved, but he let the guy go. Same thing, like there are people who need to be told, listen, we're inviting you to follow in the way of Jesus, and there are going to be parts of following Jesus that are going to contradict your political ideology or your nationalism. And we're going to ask you to take up your cross and crucify those things that aren't of God and follow him. And some people are going to say, no, I'm not willing to do that. And they're going to walk away. But I would rather have those people knowingly walk away from Jesus and his church in order to be Christian nationalists or nationalists, rather than have them become nationalists under the illusion that I'm actually following Jesus doing this. Right. That's what grieves me. And that's where the witness of the church and the gospel is being destroyed by this movement, because people look at it and think, oh, that's what a Christian is.
Yeah, and that's where whether the issue is this kind of nationalism or patriotism or race or whatever it is, economics, if confronting someone because of a false god of one of those aspects drives them away from the church, they were following a false gospel. And the only way to keep them in the church would be to allow them to follow a false gospel. So in that regard, calling out a false gospel is the priority, because you don't want unity around a false gospel. That's not the kind of unity in the church that we're called to maintain.
Say that again.
You don't want unity around a false gospel. And if preserving unity requires allowing idols to coexist in the church. Somebody said on Twitter, talking about Christian nationalism, if you say your church doesn't have a Christian nationalism problem and you have a flag on the platform, take the flag off the platform and see what happens. And you'll find out.
Yeah,
you will find out.
I'm glad you bring that up, Phil, because I mean, you and I have been a part of the same church for a long time and in a very diverse place for many years. And there's a lot of discussion about unity there. And unity is a great Christian value. And it's something that's championed by Jesus himself in his high priestly prayer. And Paul talks about this all the time with all the problems and diversity that they had in a lot of the early church. But we forget that unity is not the goal. Unity is a byproduct. The goal is that we are all one in Christ. And as a result of our unity in Christ, we're unified with one another. But in a lot of Christian communities, we just thought, well, we need to be unified. I don't want to preach anything that's going to be divisive. I don't want to lose people over politics or something. It was like, well, wait a minute. If you're all unified because you're all white, conservative, Republican, Christian nationalists, you may well have unity, but it's not unity in Christ. And that's a problem.
That reminds me, Phil, of that article you sent by Russell Moore today.
Yeah.
He said a lot of that stuff in there.
That theology can't save us because theology isn't what's dividing us right now. Culture and politics are dividing us. We'll post that article too, because it was a good one. I had a great article from Jamar Tisby talking about race and the death of the evangelical racial reconciliation movement, but we're all out of time, so I'm going to have to hold that for next week, probably, or the week after that. We'll have to see when we have time to get back to that one.
Phil, by then it won't be Black History Month anymore, and we can't talk about those issues.
When people are listening to this, it won't be Black History Month anymore, Sky, and I can talk about it whenever I want to.
I'm joking, obviously.
I don't follow the false gospel of themed months. So there. Hey, everybody who supports us on Patreon, we so much appreciate it. You keep us going, you keep the trains running, and we've got fun stuff coming up, including the 500th episode, which you can participate in fun ways. Are you going to explain that in the middle-y bits, Sky? How
Sure.
They can participate in the 500th episode? Okay, you'll hear how to participate. You can participate in the 500th episode and make it even more exciting for everyone else. And we really appreciate your support, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
The Holy Post is brought to you by our listeners who support us on Patreon. This episode is also sponsored by our friends at Faithful Counseling. We can all agree the last couple of years have been nuts. Sure, you can unload all your troubles on your best friend, or your cat, or that David Hasselhoff poster on your wall. But what if you could talk to a trained professional? Nothing against your cat or David Hasselhoff, but Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states. And you don't have to go into an office. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions. Plus, you can chat and text with your therapist. With expertise in depression, stress, anxiety, trauma, family conflicts, and more. Not happy with your counselor? Ask for a new one at any time. Financial aid is available for those who qualify. Plus, Holy Post listeners get 10% off your first month from our sponsor, Faithful Counseling. What have you got to lose? Give it a try. Go to faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Just fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs, and you'll get matched with a counselor you'll love. That's faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And now, back to the show.
As Phil just said, we are rapidly approaching our 500th episode, and we never could have gotten this far without the help of our Patreon supporters. We really appreciate you, and so we want to make you a part of this 500th episode celebration. If you go to our Patreon page, you can record a brief audio message recalling a favorite memory from the Holy Post. It might be a guest or an article or news of the butt, something that captured for you what makes the Holy Post so special and impactful. We're going to select some of those audio recordings to use in our 500th 500th episode, so we'd love to have as many as possible. Thank you for supporting our show. Thank you for sharing your memories of the Holy Post, and we look forward to celebrating with you in a few weeks. My friend David Kinnaman is back this week. He is the CEO of the Barna Group, and he's here for another edition of Barna Briefs, where he gives Holy Post listeners the early scoop on new data that Barna is uncovering about trends going on in the church and our culture. And this time he's here to talk about how churches are actually measuring their effectiveness. What do they look for to determine if they're actually making disciples of Jesus? And it's one of those cases where, frankly, the data is kind of disheartening, but it leads into a greater discussion about what we should be doing to determine whether or not we're actually being effective in our communities. And then he engages the topic that we've already addressed in this episode, Christian nationalism. A shocking number of pastors say it's a big problem, but what are we supposed to do about it? David's insights are really helpful. If you want to get deeper behind these numbers and the data, I encourage you to go to barna.com. And if you're a pastor, you should definitely check out barna.com/resilientpastor, which has all the data they uncovered about pastors and church leaders recently, which we talked about with Glenn Packiam in his new book that he's published with Barna, The Resilient Pastor. Okay, here is our latest edition of Barna Briefs. David Kinnaman, welcome back.
Hey, Sky, how's it going?
Good. I'm glad to do another Barna Briefs with you.
Absolutely. I mean, we're always in it for the briefs.
Since you like data, thought we would create a segment here to share with trends from everywhere. It's David Kinnaman and his Barna Briefs.
One size fits all, not available in California.
So we had Glenn Packiam on recently to talk about his book, The Resilient Pastor, which he wrote in partnership with you guys and based on a ton of data that you uncovered about pastors. But Glenn and I only kind of scratched the surface of it. So I want to spend our time together going deeper into some other aspects of that research. Before we do that, though, just kind of what has been the reception to that data so far? What are you hearing from churches and pastors about what you've uncovered?
Well, it's such a unique time to be a spiritual leader. It's unique time, I think, for any industry leader. The last couple of years have obviously done so much sort of shaking to the core of what it means to lead in institutions. And then especially if you're in the business of pulling people together from various, places into a common space. It's like if you're in the theater operating business or the concert going business or a restaurant. And then I think local churches are certainly in that, the gathering business. So I think what we're hearing is that it is a very challenging time. A lot of leaders are exhausted. A lot of leaders are, contemplating whether they want to do something different. They're wondering, if this is the way it was designed to be, in terms of just local church ministry. I think that's actually really all good sort of soul searching that's happening. And then on a kind of case-by-case basis, it's a stat, the listeners may have heard before from us the last couple of months. It's made the rounds, but 38% of pastors say they've given serious consideration to quitting in the last year. That was up from 29% at the beginning of 2021, and then very end of 2021, it was at 38%. So I think the pastors are feeling tired, feeling exhausted, feeling ready for what's next. But also I think there's, this sort of growing sense of, okay, let's lean in among those who are really sticking it out and feeling, encouraged and energized. I think this moment of disruption actually represents a ton of ministry potential and, an opportunity to really rethink things at a deep level, whether that's on an individual basis, what am I called to do next, or at a corporate level, what is the church writ large meant to do in the world today? And I think this moment of disruption gives us great opportunities to rethink all of that.
Yeah, moment of disruption is a good way to put it. And I know that there are plenty of church leaders, pastors in our listening audience, but not everybody. So we have a lot of just church-going people or used to go to church people. And so I want to focus some of our conversation on data that you've uncovered that relates broadly to the church and its mission and its work, and certainly intersects with the calling of the pastor. Let's start with this. One of the big sections of your research is on formation and how are pastors and churches actually seeking to make followers of Jesus and form people into disciples. So one of the stats that came out, you asked church leaders, how does your church measure the effectiveness of discipleship efforts? And I don't know if you have this in front of you or not. I'm looking at your slides. How does your church measure effectiveness? And I don't know if I should be surprised by this or not, but I'm a little bothered by it, so we got to talk about it. 54% said the number one way that they measure discipleship efforts is by overall attendance in church programs and events. And right behind it, at 51%, the proportion of congregants involved in small groups, Sunday school classes, etc. And then the third top one, engagement in serving as a volunteer. So essentially, you've asked, how do you know you're making disciples? And they've answered with, by how many people are coming into my church and my programs.
Right.
Okay. Before I give any of my opinion on that, how do you interpret that data?
Well, I'm I'm bothered by it as well, and part of the reason I'm bothered by it first I want to sort of say, survey questions can be incomplete. There's ways that perhaps we don't structure questions quite the right way. Sort of I want to kind of go into this whole conversation with a lot of humility about what it is we do know and what it is we can't know. But it's certainly true that churches measure success through, sort of attendance, gatherings, the size of it. Excuse me. And I think there's a real moment where we have, to rethink what it is that we do and how we do it. And maybe even more to the point, the thing that strikes me is I've done a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years looking at youth and young adult discipleship and the ability that the church has to retain young people. And the current number is that 64% of young people who grow up as Christians will end up walking away from their faith or from the church. And I believe it's a reflection of what we just covered in terms of the stats that you just read off, that it's not wrong to look at those numbers. It's an important indicator, but it's also, I think, an insufficient indicator of what is really happening in the lives of people. Instead, a big study that we've done the last few years where we looked at what does it really take to disciple young people? You look at their identity in Jesus, their ability to sort of ground their sense of reality on the truth of Scripture, their connectedness with other Christians and meaningful relationships, the degree to which they live their faith out in the workplace, the degree to which they live evangelistically and generously in the world. And so those 4 or 5 categories are a much better set of metrics. And then there's so that's one way of looking at it. A bit of work, we've actually been working on a project that's coming out here in the spring called The State of Your Church, Measuring What Matters in Ministry. And that project really proposes that there are ways of measuring the health and vitality and flourishing of the people we're serving, how they're doing in their lives, as well as the thriving of our organization as a church, as an organism. And so we're very excited about the work that Barna is trying to do and has been doing, but trying to propose a different sort of set of factors of a way of thinking about ministry that goes beyond just sort of counting who showed up.
Yeah, and I want to affirm that as well, because what you guys are doing is so important, and it's not comfortable, but was it Max Dupree who said the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality?
Right.
And one of the things you're doing is defining reality. You're showing a mirror to the church to say, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And then taking the next step, having defined that reality, go, okay, how can we do this better? What are the right metrics and the right measurements? So I really appreciate that. That's what Barna is positioning itself to do. But before we get to that good news, we do need to dwell a little bit more on this bad news. When I was pretty young in ministry, just a few years into a local church pastoring, and I was an associate pastor, there was a significant conflict that impacted our church. It happens to every church sooner or later. And the senior pastor had been there for like 30 years. And I remember talking to him about this unfolding crisis. And he said one of the more difficult aspects of it all was realizing that people he had known for many, many years who had been very engaged, great attenders, committed members, were not as mature in their faith as he had assumed. And part of what that revealed is just attending church in and of itself doesn't make you a disciple. And sitting under sermons and preaching and going to classes doesn't mean you're actually growing in your faith. Yet that's what most of our churches are measuring. And it makes sense why, because as a pastor, just practically speaking, you're there to run an organization. You're there to run this 501c3 church. And the board and others are going to be looking at statistics like attendance and giving and involvement as a metric of your success in that leadership role. But on a deeper level, we're not called to run a church. We're called to shepherd people and make disciples. And those metrics are very, very different. What are you go a little bit deeper into what you're seeing as really good, positive alternative measurements? I remember talking to Dallas Willard about this years ago and asking him, how do we know if we're actually growing disciples? And it can feel like it's really hard to get your hands around like numbers and how do you know that's happening? So you mentioned some things like vocational involvement, but what do you actually measure to know if it's working?
Well, the good news is there's researchers like Barna and many others that are been looking at these kinds of questions for a while. And I think there's a way of, using templated questions. That's what sort of Barna offers. We've got this project called Church Pulse, where you can actually, look at how well the people in your church are doing vocationally. So there's, sort of tried and true questions. We've been drafting off some work by a gentleman by the name of Tyler Vanderweel, who's out of Harvard looking at human flourishing. And so you can ask these templated questions, these preset questions that I think help to advance a clear understanding of how people are doing. Again, that's in the category of the flourishing of people. Their mental and emotional well-being, their physical well-being, their financial and vocational well-being, their spiritual well-being, and their relational well-being are these sort of 5 areas of human flourishing. And then when it comes to, the church thriving, we've got these sort of different metrics as well that look at how we're doing as a church, as an institution, as a group. That's sort of also part of the church pulse. So that's one set of solutions. Like, there are ways that by having standardized questions, we can compare against norms. Again, that's sort of a technical answer, but the more important answer, I think, is that we have to embrace a philosophy of caring about this. We have to, we have to care about it. And I do think that there is, if there's, good in the pandemic, it in part is showing and revealing what you just mentioned. Not only are people who are in the building or part of the church not as far along as they probably should be, but there's a lot of evidence in our research, and I'm sure any pastor will sort of attest to this, that we've realized over the last year that the people that we thought were really engaged just aren't. They're just not that into you. And so we have, I think, a big responsibility as leaders to think about how we're building people who are very resilient in their faith, and that is going to require a different set of how we think about the work of ministry and how we measure what matters. And I think you get what you measure. You end up, if the most important indicators of success are how large the church is, that's what we'll look at. And honestly, Scott, I mean, I'd love to hear from you about what you think could help. Obviously this is an area you've been passionate about for a long time, but how could we set up a system in our church communities where we could actually acknowledge leaders who are doing a really good job at this? Because I think part of what happens is that you get salary and staff and sort of status from building a large church. And so I'm just not sure. I have this question I'm curious about, is like, how do we reset the game board, the how do we acknowledge leaders who are actually doing something new and different, where it may not look like the biggest church, but it's actually the deepest church?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to your point that you end up getting what you measure, you guys also break down this this question about how do you measure discipleship based on church size. Mm-hmm. And what you've revealed is that the bigger the church is, the more likely they are to focus on attendance numbers as the key metric of discipleship. So, there you go. When you're primarily focused on growth, you're going to measure how many people are coming into my program, but that's not necessarily an indication of spiritual depth or maturity. Also kind of shocking, 22% of churches you ask, or leaders you ask, say they don't measure discipleship at all, which is like, well, do you understand what calling you've been given? Like, you've been called to make disciples, and if you're not measuring that in any way, that's kind of scary. But to your question, I don't know if I have any super thoughtful input here, but I'm referring back to conversations I had with like Dallas Willard and others who I think we just need to grow our imaginations a little bit. It is possible to measure things. For example, I can't cite the Barna data, but I know that some folks have found that the more regularly a person engages with scripture, the more they tend to grow in their faith. Well, that's something we can measure, right? We could put out a survey in our congregation and ask people, maybe anonymously, how many times a week do you open the Bible and read it? And get a baseline answer from our people. And then 6 months or 12 months later, ask the question again and see if we've moved the needle. Are people opening up their Bibles more? Or Dallas used to talk about anger as a key metric of discipleship, that if people are feeling angry regularly, that's going to come out in their interpersonal relationships. So you could survey married couples, for example, in your congregation and just ask them on a scale of 1 to 5, where would you put the health of your marriage? Get a baseline. And then a year later, do the question again and ask, see, has it moved at all? Meaning, has their involvement in this community made their most intimate or closest personal relationship healthier or less healthy? And over time, you can see with those metrics moving. And I'm sure there's many, many others we could talk about. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
How many meaningful relationships do you have with someone in your life who's not a Christian? And if that's a value that you want to inculcate in your community, measure it, get a baseline, and then see, well, what can we do to move that along, and then measure it again. But when all we're measuring are the ABCs, attendance, buildings, and cash, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get people who come regularly, give money, and volunteer to grow that institution, which is not at all an indication of spiritual fruit.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you're speaking a researcher's love language here, and not just because I love data, but because I love the use of this kind of perspective shaping tools as we lead. And a good example of then how that could be applied is, again, Barna's been providing these different frameworks, whether we're talking about human flourishing or organizational thriving or various ways of looking at this. But let's say you believe that your church is called to make a real difference in your community, and the reputation of your church in the community is really important. And so you're going to measure the degree to which people in your church believe and live that out. Are they involved in community activities? Are they seeing opportunities to invite non-Christians to the church? Are they caring for the poor? Things on scripture, what we just talked about. So let's say you believe your church should be oriented around scripture engagement, which, as you said earlier, a lot of data is pointing to that as one of the key, if not the key, opportunity for us, that the more people are engaged in scripture on their own and in community, the more discipleship that happens, and the more outreach oriented they are, and just the more generous they are. And so let's say you want to sort of track how we're doing in terms of scripture engagement in our church. And, again, there's just loads of really good existing questions that Barna has, as well as, like just make some really good questions up and sort of say, we're interested in measuring the degree to which you just love the Bible. If you're interested in the emotional climate of the church, because it turns out people don't always just remember the content, they remember what they felt. You could measure kind of what is the type of emotional, connectedness that people have when they come and experience the church. And I believe that's so important, by the way, with young people, because so often young people are leaving their faith communities because they really feel sidelined. They feel like the content is dumbed down. They feel like a lack of challenge. They feel as though they're being pandered to. They feel disconnected. They feel more connected to, people of their own age group or other, people who are not religious at all. The world, as the scriptures say, sort of pulls them in and sucks them in, and sucks them away from sort of the warm emotional climate of the church, which, again, maybe we haven't actually done a good job of cultivating that warm emotional climate. I think a lot of your listeners, will have been on their own faith journey, and they will probably attest to the fact that one of the major, challenges that they experienced was that they actually feel like the church was the least Christian, the least hospitable, the least warm and welcoming and forgiving environment. And, there's a real sort of trail of tears, a real set of challenges, I think, that many of us as church leaders have to own up to. So I think those are good examples of some things that I think would be really great to measure. And again, just spend some time. I mean, I'd encourage church communities to think about what are our core values and how will we embody them, and then how will we create some real simple to use but meaningful metrics of what it means that, when we're living this way of Jesus, we're going to look and act and think differently. And here's how we might tell whether that's actually happening in our community.
Yeah, it just takes some imagination and creativity. I'm thinking of another example. Years ago, I was out at Robert Gelinas' church in Colorado. Is it Colorado Christian? Is it Colorado Community Church?
Yeah, one of those two. Yeah, in the Denver area. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Robert Gelinas, great guy, and we had a conversation about how they measure the generosity of their community. And I thought this was great because most churches look at how much are people giving to the church and what's our budget look like, and are we meeting budget, and are people stepping up and doing that? And that's certainly valid, but he said that's not a real reflection of the generosity of our people. So they invited, I don't know if they still do this, but they would invite their congregation to self-report, I think around tax time, self-report, maybe anonymously, how much money are they donating to other organizations, charities, missions groups, Christian organizations, whatever. How much money are they donating to all those other organizations? And then they would actually have a service where they put up on the screen how much money their people are giving to all these other ministries, globally, nationally, whatever. And then they celebrate that generosity and they pray for all of those other ministries that their people are involved in and contributing to, which is a more accurate reflection of the generosity of that congregation than just what are they giving to their church budget. And there's something really affirming to me about that. If I were a member there, to know that what the leaders of this congregation are measuring shows what they really value. And it shows they're thinking about the world more than just their little piece of, what God's up to. So anyway, challenge to church leaders, anybody in the church, look at what's being measured and why. Let me turn a corner.
I want to just quickly comment that I think that's such a cool story, and it's actually sparking for me as something that's been sort of long dormant in my imagination about how Barna could serve. And we're trying to do more and more of this, but it's almost like trying to highlight sort of new and better practices. Like that's a great way for churches to do something like that. I was telling a friend this last week how at the church I've attended for many years, they don't actually light the stage during the worship, so you can see the silhouettes of people. I mean, you can see it's a darkened room, and so you can still see their people, and you can see sometimes a little bit of a facial expression, but it de-emphasizes the performance of people who are leading worship. And again, this is not a place for me just to sort of weigh in on all the good, the bad, and the ugly of worship. But I will say that certainly there's some performative, kind of like there's some great stuff around our worship communities, and there's also some things that might be edging towards like a more performative side. And again, I'm a firm believer, like we could be excited in God's presence, and we should have the very best of what everyone else has. Like it's okay to have sound amplification, and it's okay to have lights, and it's okay to have projected lyrics, but it's also like it's okay for us to look at what's the impact of all of these choices that we make, and what that then signals to people about either participating in worship or not participating in worship. And that, by the way, is something that could be measured. You could ask people, to what degree do you feel like you're watching a performance, or to what degree do you feel like you're being ushered into a worship event of God? And that's like, maybe we don't want to have the answers to that questions because it's easier to use the fog machines and to believe that, that the level of anointing is sort of equal to the level of coolness in our worship. But I do think that there's, again, I say all that without really any cynicism. I really mean it's like God uses all sorts of worship contexts, and I think that's wonderful. And we should be very committed, I believe, as leaders, to figuring out what is then the journey we're taking people on. And I do wonder if part of all of our efforts here, and speaking specifically of Barna, but all of us, is like let's be on a mission to look for some new and different ways of thinking about the practice of church leadership and being a part of a church, so that we can actually figure out if there's some better ways to do this. Like that, what you said about Robert Gelinas, a great pastor, is a great example of that. And are there other ways that we could take the clues and cues from other churches that are trying some things that might end up helping us actually increase the impact of our discipleship efforts? And I think that's what we're all here for. So
amen. Okay, one last thing I want to touch on before we let you go. I didn't know this was going to be part of the report, but I was encouraged that it was. You asked Christian leaders, pastors, how concerned are they about Christian nationalism right now? And this stat kind of surprised me. So 73% said they are very or somewhat concerned about the rise of Christian nationalism. I mean, that's a huge number. So here's why it surprised me. How many of them are actually talking about it?
Yeah.
I don't know if you asked that question.
Well, we've been tracking pretty regularly now the last 6-8 years, and really for as long as we've been in existence as a company, we've been trying to amplify the voice of pastors and the questions and concerns they have. What we've been focusing on the last 6 to 8 years is the question of, sort of faith leadership in a divided society.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly the last 4 years have been very divisive. It's if like you look back over the Bush years and then Obama years and the Trump years, and so it's like it's not a brand new phenomenon, but we have seen that with the rise of social media and the pressures that people have, and sort of there's a lot of good Pew data and others that say there's even fewer Americans at the middle. There's even more extremism in the parties,
right?
And so I think faith leaders, pastors, are sort of pulled at the seams there. We've done a research that I won't have the numbers offhand, but more pastors than ever are telling us they feel pressured to talk about things or pressure not to talk about certain things. They're feeling that pressure from people in their congregations. They're feeling that pressure from people outside their congregations. And it really is a very difficult time, I think, for leaders to sort of articulate not just a centrist view, but a gospel view, because there's so much sort of, people are being discipled by their screens, and that's true of young people. That's true of older people. It's true of those that watch Fox News or CNN or left or right. People are much more likely to be shaped through the political rhetoric than they are through the sort of the Christian story. And so I think pastors are really working hard at their best to do that. It's a very difficult sort of line to walk. And again, I think there's good work for each of us as leaders and as people of faith to sort of figure out how do we lead through these contentious times to articulate a true biblical ethic that's sort of more conservative than the conservatives and more liberal than the liberals, and more in tune with what God is asking the church to be in this moment. And certainly this is such an important topic, we won't do it justice, but the question of the role and reputation of the evangelical community in this moment, politically, socially, and then spiritually in our world and in our society and in the U.S. is a critical question that I think continues to need a lot of work.
Yeah, I think what strikes me about this statistic, though, is there are many, many, many concerning things going on in society, and pastors may well be concerned about them. What's different, though, is Christian nationalism is a direct heretical interpretation of our faith. You could poll pastors and ask them, are you concerned about what the New York Times is doing now that they've bought Wordle? And you might get 80% of pastors going, yeah, I'm concerned about it. But what the New York Times does with Wordle is not a direct threat to the integrity of the gospel.
Sure.
Whereas Christian nationalism is a direct threat to the integrity of the gospel and the witness of the church. And so when 73% of pastors say, yeah, I'm very concerned about this, I go, okay, good.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great indicator.
You got to say something. You have to say something about this.
It's a great indicator of, I think the fact that pastors have their finger on the pulse of some trends that are concerning, and it is difficult for them to speak about it, and that's not the way it should be. But this gets back to our, where we started our conversation, is that largely we have a discipleship problem in our society, where people, if you say something, people are going to quit your church and find another church they find to be a more conducive environment. And so we have a very highly reactive society. Christians are at least as reactive as the rest of the society. Christian leaders are trying their very best to try to disciple people through a period of great disruption. And I think and I think it's really hard, because these words, part of my job as a researcher is to understand the power of words. And, this is a weird place my brain's going, but I'm just going to go through this whole exercise for a second. So, I was thinking recently, I had never heard anybody observe this, but I was talking about something related to Abraham Lincoln and, the saving of the Union. Obviously, there's a whole set of things that are happening in San Francisco about renaming public schools that have Abraham Lincoln, right? So there's a real like the word Abraham Lincoln, it carries meaning and like he was a flawed leader, but also a leader who did some remarkable things. And so how do we think about the expression of the words, the heroes, the leaders, the things we aspire to? And we're in a really critical moment as a society about what these words, what our history means and how we move forward and all that. And I was thinking about the fact that had God not worked through Lincoln and the political environment of that time and save the Union, it's unclear and probably unlikely that America would have entered World War I and World War II with the same sort of balance of power shifting capabilities, right? So like the U.S. was in some part saved for for its role in the 19th century, was saved for its role in the 20th century. And so there's important things for us to be thinking as a society and then as a church community about God's work in the world, how how it is that God is using even countries and nations, and there's almost like a political theology, a discipleship that is required of us. I think that's where a lot of leaders are sort of struggling. Is it's so hard to articulate, like, what does it mean to be Christian, much less someone who's sort of sort of deeply immersed in a culture where we are all voters, we're all active politically, we should be. And so how does a church actually embody those things when there's so much controversial topics? And then as soon as you use one word, you've triggered someone to go down a different path, or you've it's like, no, that's not what I meant. When I said, Abraham Lincoln might've been used by God. It's like, no, wait, hold on. Like here's what I really meant. And so it's so complicated for us, I think, as leaders today to be able to figure out how then the church should show up in the political space, in the in the sort of the marketplace, in education, in the roles of households, in technology. And so that's my heart goes out to pastors and leaders, because it is so complicated today. It's much more complicated. You get your head clipped off no matter what you say, which is why I think a lot of pastors are going to the sort of like, the turtle strategy, just keep your head in your shell. Don't say too much. Don't piss people off. But I do think that there's a real opportunity for us as leaders then to say, here's what it means to sort of, one of my great friends, a great leader, Barry Corey, is president of Biola University, says, we should have, firm centers and soft edges, and, embody the Christian ethic of the fruits of the Spirit in all the ways we interact with our society and our neighbors, but be firmly convinced of our convictions at the core. And I think that's, sort of the model for ministry, the model for faithful Christian witness in the days to come.
Well put. David, thank you for the research and for sharing again in this Barna Brief what you guys are up to. And again, we've barely touched on, there's just mountains of data that you guys have got here that's in the Resilient Pastor book and is online. If you are interested in learning more about this, if you are a church leader, or you have even a lay leadership role in the church, or you just want to support pastors and churches in being more effective at making disciples, guiding them towards the challenges of what it means to shepherd in this moment, go to barna.com/resilientpastor, and you can get access to the book and a lot of the data and research. And we look forward to having you back again soon, David, to talk about more of what you guys are uncovering.
Thanks so much, Sky. It's a pleasure to be working with you guys, and lots of fascinating, developments in our society, and what an exciting time to be leading and living and thinking about what God is up to in our times.
Indeed. Thanks, David.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.